ABC News reports that Donald Trump's former fixer, Michael Cohen, has been talking to the special counsel's office over the course of the last month. He reportedly sat for multiple sessions lasting hours. The network says the interviews have focused on all aspects of Trump's dealings with Russia, financial, business, and alleged collusion in the 2016 election. ABC reports that investigators were also interested in whether the president or any of his associates dangled a pardon before Cohen. Cohen is also reportedly working with the state of New York on a separate investigation into the inner workings of the Trump family charity and the Trump organization. He's just a treasure chest.
That's a shame because the president can't pardon anybody charged in New York.
My goodness gracious, there's so much to talk about. That's where he worked for a decade as an executive vice president and special counsel. Both Mueller's office and Cohen's attorney declined to comment. The president's attorney, Rudy Giuliani, responded, telling NBC News Cohen has a history of lying. Oh,
wait, but didn't he say that Cohen? I'm sorry, didn't he say that Cohen was?
Fixer.
He said Cohen was a wonderful man. And
did he lie for the president? That's why he knows deep inside that he's a serial liar, because he lied so much. He must.
But Rudy said. Rudy said that Cohen was a good man.
Right.
And Rudy is a good man. You know, I'm just curious. Let's confirm really quickly here if Cohen actually is talking to Robert Mueller. Donnie Deutsch, you talk to Cohen all the time. What are y'all talking about these days?
What's interesting, as of a couple of weeks ago, we almost spoke every day and in great detail about a lot of things on a personal and
so what's he telling about Mueller? Like, what's the room like? Does he drink a Diet Coke?
Here's what's happened in the last couple of weeks.
What?
He all of a sudden the responses are, hey, yeah, we'll speak next week. He never said he was talking to Mueller, but everything changed. And my interpretation was clearly...
Donnie, doesn't that happen to you all the time?
Well, that's usually with women, but Mueller clearly said to him, son, we are in the adult dining room now, and you may have best friends and you may have relatives, but you will be speaking
to never talk to a guy that wears a gangster suit with an orange tie.
We need to talk to someone who doesn't get cut off from conversations on a regular basis. Joining us now, senior reporter at Vanity Fair and at NBC News, and MSNBC contributor Emily Jane Fox. Has he cut you off?
I've been in touch with people in Michael Cohen's orbit.
You can't ask that question.
Well, I'm just curious. Well, not Donnie style.
I haven't been ghosted by anyone in Michael Cohen's orbit so far.
Well, not ghosted. It's just the conversations are very different. He wished me a happy Yom Kippur. It's just very changed.
It's very sweet. Things in Michael Cohen's universe have certainly tightened. And I reported last Friday that Michael had been in talks with Robert Mueller, and it was accepted in his circle that these conversations had started. So here's what I know from people in this world. Not only is he talking to Robert Mueller about things that he knew related to Russia, which is what the Mueller investigation is focused on, he is talking to the Southern District, obviously, about the campaign finance payments that he made to women. He's talking to the Attorney General about what he knows about the foundation. There is nothing that is off limits to Michael, and this is why. He has a family. Michael Cohen has accepted the fact that he is going to prison. So whatever he can do to lessen his prison sentence, to get the government to possibly say to a judge in December when he is sentenced, look, this guy was very cooperative, we recommend a lighter sentence, he is going to do right now. He also feels like the president did absolutely nothing to protect him. In fact, he did things to actively hurt him. And so he has absolutely no reason, no feeling like I'm going to do anything to protect this man.
Are there any theories why Donald Trump threw him under the bus?
Who doesn't he throw under the bus?
No, I know,
we couldn't understand that.
It's illogical that you wouldn't bring this man who knows so much, who had a front row seat to everything that not only the president did in a lot of situations, but that his 3 adult children did. Why you wouldn't bring that man in if he was facing trouble. And I think, from my sense of things, is the president knew that Michael Cohen had done bad things on his behalf and perhaps on his own behalf, and so cut bait. That was the strategy.
Michael couldn't understand it either. I would ask him that all the time.
How do you take the...
And let me just finish for a second. He was astounded. To add one other thing on to Emily, beyond obviously just wanting to, as anybody would, do everything to save his family, right after the Helsinki thing, I remember Michael said to me, you know, look, beyond saving me, this has got to change. You know, another thing kicked in, the country thing kicked in. Now, as I said, I'm not saying that he's not doing it to protect himself also, but something happened at that moment. Something struck him like, oh my God, this guy is in charge now. And I'm gonna say saw God at that moment, but something also shifted.
Yeah.
What is it about a hanging at dawn, focusing the mind?
Yeah.
Well, if you talk to people who've worked for Trump, who work when he was at the Trump Organization, or even in the White House today, especially in the White House today, I should say, there is no sense of loyalty to him whatsoever. They do not feel like they have anything to gain from him. And in fact, they feel like after they leave the White House, they'll be toxic. They can't do. So this has created this sense that, you know, what am I doing this for? So taking one of the very few people, Michael Cohen, who felt a sense of loyalty to Trump, and basically discarding him is really just a dumbfounding move. He's one guy, other than his children, one of the one guys who felt any loyalty to this man.
Well, and as you say, Emily, speaking of the children, it's not just Donald Trump who is exposed now because Michael Cohen's talking to investigators and Robert Mueller. It's the children are now in focus because he was in the middle of it all.
Look, Michael Cohen still lives in the building where Jared and Ivanka live in New York. This is someone who is so inextricably tied and linked to the entire Trump family, who worked side by side with all three of his adult children. He also has felt in the last couple of months that there has been a concerted effort by Don Jr., by Jared Kushner, by Rudy Giuliani, to throw him under the bus, not just the president, but his children as well. And so it's just a dangerous place for the Trump family.
To Emily's
right now.
point, I think there's even more loathing towards Jr. and Jared, particularly Jr., because there was this built-in affection for the boss for a long time, and there's that scorn feeling. But his brow would even furrow more when he would talk about the kids. But to the opening tease, Trump has a lot to worry about, a lot. And Emily and I have both been privy to a lot of the things that Michael knows, and boy, oh boy.
All right, Emily Jane Fox, thank you very much. We'll see what happens. Still ahead is the Republican Party suffering from an identity crisis. This morning, Axios is looking at the short and long-term risks for the GOP now that it is effectively the Trump Party, leaving swaths of traditional conservatives with no home. We'll be right back.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.